Okay, we'll get started. I'm David Gardner from Pinch Unlimited. We're going to talk today about being ready for government inspectors, and just a little bit of my background. I've been doing health and safety and environmental compliance for about 35 years. I used to work for the Ministry of Labor, and that's where obviously a lot of the experience that I have with dealing with government inspectors kind of comes from being on the other side of the table. But I've also since then dealt extensively with them on this side of the table as either working with my past employer and dealing with Ministry of Labor inspectors and appealing orders and that kind of stuff, dealing with prosecutions and a few other things. There's also a few other people on the line here that it's worth introducing. They can chime in as we go through, but for all people in Ontario, there's maybe we'll have Brian Agnew introduce himself. He's the outpatient health and safety manager out of the Waterloo office.
Hey everybody, I'm Brian Agnew. I've been with the Waterloo office doing OH&S for the last 20 years. I have my CIH and CRSP, and we'll be happy to help anybody out. Thanks.
And that's what he's there for. And in the GTA area, we have Ryan Mallard.
Hello, my name is Ryan Mallard, and similar to Brian, I've been with Pinchin for 20 years and have both my CRSP and CIH, Certified Industrial Hygienist certification. So we're here to help you out on any of your hygiene or occupational health and safety needs.
All the help you can handle. The other thing, one of the notes is because I've been doing this for 35 years, I actually retire in less than a month. And it's perhaps, even though he's out in the West, Chris Taylor is the new national practice leader for Pinchin, and maybe Chris can just introduce himself for a few minutes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Taylor. As David mentions, yes, beginning of May, I'll take over from David. I haven't got the 35. I've got 28 years of experience, about 18 with Pinchin as ROHT here in the West, but supporting all of our services, and you're ably and completely supported by Brian and Ryan for the region. So I'm here as much as a support system for them and for the company.
And there you go. So I guess I'll kind of take over here. So the question is, are you ready for government inspectors? And I don't know if you can ever be completely ready, because you really have to realize is you don't always know what you're going to get when they knock on your door. I hear a lot of things when I'm out doing audits. Well, the inspector was in here and the inspector said this and this and we're okay. And what you have to always remember is you never know what inspector is going to walk through the door, what their agenda is. And things change quite a bit from when they're on site doing inspections, for instance, compared to when they're doing investigations. And a lot of the things that inspectors may say during an inspection, when they're doing an investigation of the fatality, a critical injury or work refusal, they're going to be driven completely by what the legislation says. And so things may change. So you need to be very careful. And one of the key things is we'll talk about is making sure you understand what your obligations are so that you know what you need to do and not what an inspector tells you is okay or not, because that, like I said, that can change with a new knock on the door and a new inspector. So this is kind of an exaggerated picture of what can happen for environmental things, but strange enough, you hear lots of different things. People, well, we're doing stuff outdoors like this, and we don't have to worry about it. I did my master's thesis that I did while I was still with the Ministry of Labor, allowed me to do a bunch of air monitoring at waste management sites across Ontario. And the only one that actually had exceedances of the standards was one that didn't look that much dissimilar to this operation here, where they were doing a lot of dispensing and transferring outdoors. So, being outdoors isn't necessarily going to protect you, and we're not here to talk too much about that stuff. But again, it's just understanding what your obligations are and making sure that you don't have operations like this, because an inspector walks into this situation and, you know, it's gonna be a whole different ball of wax. I know one place where we got a complaint when I was with the ministry, and I didn't go out, but an inspector went out because somebody got fired, and that was why they called and complained to the ministry. So, you know, those kind of things happen. And when the inspectors showed up, what this place used to do is they used to paint hockey masks for the NHL. And so he had quite the operation going there. And he had a drum much similar to this, with a bunch of screening stuff in it. And he thought it was like magic that when he poured xylene and waste paint in there, that his xylene disappeared. Like he just thought it, you know, disappeared into the air, or whatever. As soon as the Ministry of Labor inspector saw that, that inspector called the Ministry of Environment, and then that was the end of that operation. The last time the inspector saw the person who owned the business, he was a little remorse, few tears in his eyes, and all the people who worked there lost their job because they were doing a lot of things that they shouldn't be doing. And so it's, you know, one of the messages here, just because you own property doesn't mean you can contaminate it. And because in Canada, we don't really own property, we kind of rent it from the government. And unless you own mineral rights and some other things, then you really can't contaminate and do, you know, what this operation here is doing to the environment. So there's a little bit of wake up there. So, well, our objectives is to prevent you making decisions to have operations like you just saw, but really just to try and get you prepared for it, and really talk about a system whereby they don't need to visit you. And the Ministry of Labor, Skills Development and Training, as they're called now, and the Ministry of Environment, Conservations and Parks, you know, they have things that they do. They have a lot more targets than they used to. When I was an inspector, we had a box would show up with paper every month, and there'd be a list of places we had to go visit. And every company that was registered with the ministry essentially was on a schedule for how often you're going to go and see them, anywhere from a month to 3 years. That doesn't exist anymore, as far as I know, unless it's changed. They now have targets, and we'll talk a little about that later. And so inspectors, if they don't think they need to come and visit you, then they're not going to. And so you got to give them reason to not visit you. And this is why having a good system in place is going to protect you, so that, you know, the ministry shows up and they see everything is under control, and you don't have the situations where you have critical injuries, or, you know, have fatalities, or have work refusals and complaints, and all the other things that drives the ministry to come in regardless of their plan. So it's really about your system that's going to help you prevent these things from happening, because the last thing you want to do is be like this fellow and be in a court of law. Because there's a lot of situations, and we'll talk about contractors, where the ministry, and this is a strategy that was used certainly when I was with the ministry, where if the inspector is not sure who's responsible, it was not uncommon to charge a number of employers. So if you have contractors on site doing things, and that contractor worker gets hurt or refuses to work, the ministry is going to come in, and you're going to look, and you're going to try and see who has control. And if they're not sure about that, then like I said, a common strategy is to charge everybody. And even if you're innocent, we know you're all innocent, of course, going to court is going to be very expensive. And because there's a lot of reasons why you're not just going to show up and try and defend yourself, because this is fairly serious stuff. And so you don't want to end up in jail, and you want to be like this where you're celebrating. Yes, the ministry came in, they went away, they didn't issue any orders, they're happy with us. We hope we never see them again. So,
David, I'm just going to interrupt. We had a question came in on the chat. You're doing a lot of references to the ministry. The question was, would this be similar provincial or federal? And I suggested that this was likely conceptually the same process, independent of your references, but maybe you could speak to that a little bit at this point.
Yeah, certainly. If you're looking at it provincially, my experience has been dealing with the federal government is their inspectorate is not nearly as aggressive. And I'm hesitant to say it, but the Ministry of Ontario inspectors are very well educated as well and know their legislation. Not that the federal government doesn't, but they seem to have a different way of working things. They have these voluntary compliance things they can issue and other things, but there certainly has been charges under the federal legislation, but nothing like Ontario. I think Alberta is maybe the next one on the list for the number of prosecutions that happen. You go to provinces like Manitoba and you'll have a hard time finding places where provincial inspectors there actually charge employers. But Ontario is probably the most litigious place. So, but fundamentally, Chris is right. There's no fundamental difference between dealing with an inspector from the federal government, dealing whether it's Environment Canada, whether it's a Ministry of Environment in Ontario, Ministry of Labor Ontario. They're all just people, and you need to deal with them by having a good system in places. And that's going to be the bottom line that I'm going to try over and over again to convince you of, is having that good system in place is good business. And it is a way to keep inspectors out of your workplace. And if they do show up, for them to feel like what I'm going to talk about, do you get it? And I'll have a couple of case studies that talk about what that means for a Ministry of Labor inspector or a Ministry of Environment inspector, federal or provincial or territorial for that matter. And hopefully that answered the question, but you're not going to find too many differences. It could be the skill level and how aggressive they are. It may change depending on the province. You know, you get new parties in the province and all of a sudden the Ministry of Labor is this or that. Things change sometimes, obviously, with political parties. So why are you here? This is, what I think the reasons you may be here. I'm not sure what the real reason is. Maybe you just really like pension seminars and know you get value from them. Maybe you're trying to find that out, but there's a lot of reasons why you would want to attend this seminar. And it really is, it's not just legislative requirements. A lot of our clients, certainly at pension, because we have some fantastic large employers as clients in Canada, and they have ethical reasons. There's a few of them out there, but I haven't met too many managers, even though you may think some of them are, don't really care about things that don't have some ethics when it comes to making sure that they're trying to protect their workers. They may be driven by the almighty dollar sometimes, but typically people try and act ethically. Reputation is a big one. We do a lot of audits for a lot of clients. And the main reason, one of the reasons, not the main reason, is that they're worried about reputational risk. So they may be investment companies and REITs and these kind of things that they want to make sure that nothing bad happens at their properties and gets them in the press. And when you're looking to invest your dollars, that you'll invest it with companies like this that buy buildings, manage them and sell them and make money for their investors. So reputation can be very, very important. Just think about being a car manufacturer. Do you want to be the big car manufacturer where there's fatalities going on and people are going, geez, I'm not going to buy from those guys. They're killing people all the time. So there's a lot of reasons for doing this. Personal reasons, there's a few things I'll talk about as we go along, but there's a lot of good personal reasons why you'd want to be in compliance. And the main one for me, and sometimes you may think it's funny that a health and safety person is talking about this, but it is all about business. I've seen the companies that had great systems in place that are still in business today, and companies literally across the street that have been through receivership a number of times. And I can tell you from my experiences working for the Ministry of Labor, that these two companies had two different ways of looking at things. And good business means good health and safety and good environmental management. It's as simple as that. It really does get down to dollars and cents because that's what makes our world go around. And these things are very important. And all the other things, the personal reputation, ethical risks, can all be wrapped up somehow in what we do with money. because obviously the safest company is the one that isn't operating, that you don't go to. And it's very simple that, you're going to lose that when a company goes out of business. So that's not what we want. We want really good systems in place to protect people and protect businesses. And as I said, good business and good environmental health and safety compliance go hand in hand. I've seen it over and over again. So some compliance principles. Ideally, the internal responsibility system involves everyone from the company. And what you'll see is things like ISO. And I don't know if you're involved with some of the ISO standards like 14,000 and 45,001 and 9,000. And a lot of companies shy away from it, but there's a lot of value to be seen in the ISO standards and the way they're written, why there's things in there. And one of the main things that have changed recently with some of the current standards is an increase in the amount of expected involvement of upper management. If you're in health and safety or environmental compliance and you work for a company where upper management is not committed to your program, I think you can already probably appreciate how frustrating it can be to work for companies like that. And this is why ISO has put so much more stress on CEOs and stuff being involved. And this is very important. But just think about some companies that say, well, just tell me what I need to do. Just tell me what I need to do. Well, what that means is there'll be thousands more inspectors, because if they have to come in and monitor everything you're doing, you're going to see them on a regular basis. And it's really, again, it gets down to cost. So this is, the internal responsibility system may seem like sometimes that it's a cop-out on the government's part, but in the real world, this is companies taking responsibility for themselves, and they really should, because they're the people that hire and have employees, and monitor the environment and all those things. So the internal responsibility system is pretty fundamental. Making sure things are guarded and different things can be pretty simple. Guarding is a good example, because we'll talk about it later. It's one of the very common hazards that we see in a lot of companies where guarding isn't adequate. Environmental compliance is no different. You're expected to be in compliance, and you shouldn't need to have the government in holding your hand to do that. And you're making sure any emissions. Again, Ontario is the lovely place on earth where there is more environmental regulations and requirements here than any other province. There's companies that have environmental compliance approvals and environmental activities and sector registrations that they don't in other provinces. It is quite extensive. But again, you just doing your homework, and the ministry, to their credit, have a lot of guidelines to follow to help you be in compliance. So there really is not a lot of excuse. So, what do you need to do? So one of the things I'm going to advise to you is that, and I've seen other employers do this, and they know the inspector, for instance, and they'll invite them in or call them and ask them for advice. And I can tell you that's a very dangerous thing to do, because when the inspector shows up, they have to do their job. And if they see something while they're there, they will have to do their job. And, you need to be not, touting, consultancies, but if you need expertise, you should be calling consultants to come in and help you out, and not the Ministry of Labor or Ministry of Environment inspectors, again, because that can be quite dangerous. But there are certain things that you need to do that will get you out of hot water. And there was a case in Dundas, not far from where I live, and a truck was carrying entrails from fish and was going to a rendering plant. As they turned the corners, they came off a ramp. Some of the fish entrails ended up on the side of the road. And so the company that did this, they cleaned it up. They actually did a pretty good job of cleaning up, because there was no remediation orders after the fact. But as that was happening, somebody was driving by and they saw it. And the first thing that person did was they called the Ministry of Environment and Conservation and Parks. I'll just call them Ministry of Environment from now on, and reported that they saw this spill. the company didn't think they needed to report it because they didn't think it caused an adverse effect. And I can tell you in every jurisdiction, dumping entrails from fish or any other animal onto the side of the road is going to have a potential environmental effect. And so they were fined something like $20,000 for not reporting that spill. And in my previous employment, we had a spill of about 1,800 liters of 96% sulfuric acid, or 93%. I'm not sure. It was very, very concentrated. And it actually happened a couple of days before I knew about it, because I was the environmental health and safety manager there. And then so the first thing I did is I went and called the Ministry of Environmental Spills Action Center, actually, and reported it. And, they wanted to know what happened, what we did to clean it up, and what we're going to do to make sure that it didn't happen again. We gave them all that information, and they never came and visited us. But because this one company didn't report, it cost them $20,000. And even though they cleaned it all up, and like I said, the ministry didn't issue any orders for them to clean anything up because they did a pretty good job. The moral of this case is that you need to understand your obligations under the law so that you can make sure you're in compliance and you're not going to have the ministry come up, because in this world of cell phones with cameras and dash cams and stuff, it's pretty hard to hide from the long arm of the law. So just be very careful and again, understand your obligations. Ministry of Labor, I can go on and on about all the stories I have there, but recognize, and this is what a lot of managers and supervisors don't realize, is they make decisions, and they should be making decisions with the understanding that if something bad happens, even if it's not their fault, they're going to feel very bad about it. And I remember somebody getting hurt at my previous employer, and the supervisor really did everything they could have done to prevent the accident from happening. That did not stop that supervisor from feeling that there must have been something that could have done to prevent that, because they were really upset about it. And this is what a lot of managers and supervisors don't realize until that happens. And so I'm trying to warn you now. The other thing is making sure, sorry, that even your good workers are doing things that are supposed to, because I can tell you my experience is very clearly, most of the time, most of the injuries that I investigated throughout my career very often happened to good workers who were trying to go the extra mile and just didn't quite understand what they're supposed to be doing. So I had a fatality investigation I did, and the worker they had these large air conditioners or heat exchangers, and they were dipping it in this material called Herosite to protect it. And one of the things they did is when they lifted it out of the vat, they made sure there was no drips on it, so that the equipment looked very nice. And the worker was given this brush to do this with a big long handle on it, so they didn't have to go put themselves underneath the suspended load. Unfortunately, the worker decided they wanted to do a better job than that and took just a normal brush and went underneath the load. And what happened is the workplace didn't understand some if you understand physics, this is simple physics. When you run chains or any other things over corners on 90-degree angles, for instance, the ability of that material to hold a load is essentially cut in half. And this is what happened here, is they had a chain that was maybe strong enough to hold up the heat exchanger, but because it ran over the edge of it, the chain was no longer strong enough, and it fell and unfortunately pinned the worker between the vat edge and the cleaner, and his head was in there and he died. But the thing I remember the most about the case was the owner of the business, because this was a small business, and sitting across the table from him and seeing him cry and be obviously very distraught, because this was a small business and he knew this person very well. And these are all the things that, again, I'm just trying to get you to understand that you need to drive and be committed to safety, because again, this is going to help you with government inspectors. because they're going to see that you have that commitment, and they're less likely to charge you if they can see that being embodied. There is another fatality that is involved with because the company wasn't maintaining their lift trucks. And in this case, it was actually the owner's nephew that was killed when he got off the lift truck, left the forks raised in the air. And when he went to go into the truck where he was going to put the load and didn't lower the forks, the lift truck rolled forward and pinned him and killed him. So, there's a lot of reasons that I can tell you for having systems in place to deal with this stuff. And, I said, the dollar is very important, but this will save you money in the long run if you have good systems in place. So I'm going to stop with all the horrors, and I think you kind of get it now what I'm trying to say. So one of the important things about legislation, and as I'll mention it maybe again later, but when the ministry comes by, you should not be afraid to ask some questions. You should not be afraid to challenge them and make sure that they're right. Because one of the first things I learned when I started with the Ministry of Labor, Joel Waterman held up the green book, much like this one, but not the Carswell version, and said, where does it say that? And there's a lot of examples of that. And if you don't understand fully all the nuances of the legislation, you will never know it as well as an inspector will. And you just don't understand why this is a requirement, then ask the inspector, where does it say that? So the very least you can go and read it and see what it says. And this is very important that you understand the minimum requirements of the law. You can certainly choose to do far more above that, but you should at least understand the minimum requirements. And it's very important that you understand all these things. And there's about 25 different regulations that you have to comply with under the health and safety legislation in Ontario. Some other provinces have a lot of these requirements consolidated into one regulation. Ontario has a bunch of different ones that, and you need to go into places like e-laws and look and see all the regulations there and try and figure out if they apply to you or not, because it could be very important. And then we have the environmental legislation, and that book should look, I don't know if it does, if you're getting across it, that looks like a big heavy book, because now we're talking about 100 or more regulations. Because now you have to not only deal with the provincial health and safety legislation, you have to deal with the environmental provincial regulations and acts, and there's a whole bunch of different acts that you have to comply with. There is all the Canadian Environmental Protection Act regulations you have to comply with. And you may be dumbfounded if you saw all the requirements, and we're not going to go through today, that are in there of things. You bring a new chemical into your workplace that has never been in Canada before. And there is all kinds of requirements that you have to report to the federal government. And you need to understand all things. And we'll talk a little bit again later about some of the common findings we have of things that people don't understand the requirement to do. So that's a very important part of it is understanding that. And yes, it's a big headache. This is why there's professionals out there like the people at Pension and other consultancies. And this is why you hire, depending on your organization, you hire people that have this expertise. They understand the legislations, they know what they need to do, and they know what you need to do. And so you need to listen to them when they're trying to give you advice. But and that's what they should be doing. I can tell you an example. My previous employer was fined by the Ministry of Environment. It was actually after I left. And the reason why is they had this flare stack that they wanted to replace. And at the time, and it's still happening today, but it took about 2 years to get environmental compliance approval. And so I went to my boss, who was the vice president of operations, and he said, we have to put this new flare stack in operation because our clients need it, and we're going to go out of business. And so I warned them, okay, this is what could possibly happen. Unfortunately, it did happen. They were charged because their environmental compliance approval has not been approved yet, even though they're waiting 2 years. But so they were fined $50,000, but you look at the dollars and cents of it, and they would have lost millions and millions of dollars of business. So that manager made a decision. And the only reason I'm telling you this is, you as professionals or managers listening to this, professionals are going to give you advice. It's up to the managers to make those decisions, and you shouldn't get frustrated if you're environmental or health and safety consultant and say they're not doing what I told them to do, because they do have a business to run, and they will make decisions, good or bad. They need to make them, but it is very important that all managers understand legislation, and if that means going to consultants or hiring very highly experienced people to help you out, this is things that they need to do to make sure you're in compliance, because it is a long list of things that you need to comply with. So some of the key OHS findings. As I mentioned, guarding is a key one, and it's because a lot of people don't understand what guarding is all about. And I can make it very simple for you. If you can stick your finger in something and your finger is going to get pinched, it needs to be guarded. And it's not more complicated than that. So these are things, that picture I saw you previously, you saw the nice yellow guard on there. What we very often see is the other side of it is not guarded and people can get their hands in there. And, this is, the ministry, when I worked for the Ministry of Labor, and this was a long time ago, we were talking about ergonomics and all kinds of wonderful things. And then the ministry kind of woke up that day. We're in a provincial meeting, and in that particular month, there was 33 fingers lost in 30 days in Ontario. And that kind of recentered the ministry at the time that, these fundamental things like guarding are still not being taken care of. And to this day, I can go into just about every workplace and find some equipment that is not guarded properly. Lockout, tagout. You may think, we hire electricians to come in perhaps to do this work, particularly if you work in a commercial business and I don't need to do anything else. Well, a lot of electricians die because they go to a piece of equipment and there's two sources of electricity to it. And if they don't know that, then how on earth are they possibly going to be able to protect themselves? So you as the building owner or the employer should have this information and make sure they have it. And to me, it's a simple thing. You have an electrician come on site and you simply just say, we want to make sure you're complying with the CSA standard for electrical safety and for lockout and tagout. And if they confirm that, you've taken one big step towards due diligence. Working at heights. I just did an audit last week. I climbed up this roof access ladder. I opened the gate, and what did I see? I saw the edge of the roof. I couldn't believe it where they put this thing. So you have to wonder, how do people that repair air conditioning systems and stuff get onto that rooftop without putting themselves in jeopardy? Because there's no way it can be guarded, and you would have to literally crawl underneath this door to get onto the roof. But don't think that, we hire professional AC repair people to go up on the roofs and stuff. You need to control who goes onto the rooftops and where they're using and where there's other exposures to working at height. So this is a very common thing, particularly in commercial buildings. And the best companies have roof waivers and have monitoring systems and do check on their contractors from time to time to make sure they're complying with this. One of the things we see quite often is skylights. And people walk on roofs and there's skylights around them. They don't even think about it twice. Well, there's been, in my career, I know of 3 fatalities where people fell through skylights. And one of them was just a few years ago, where the whole reason we're in there doing audits, because that client had a contractor who was doing something on the roof and fell through the skylight, and now the ministry was in there and they wanted to make sure they had all their ducks in a row. So you don't want to be that person. So there's a lot of fall hazards you might not even be aware of. So look out for skylights for sure. General office ergonomics. A lot of times you do audits and you kind of rush through the office because you're worried about that big industrial workplace where all the hazards are. You think about this. Somebody goes off with carpal tunnel syndrome, and they may be off work for anywhere from 6 weeks to 8 weeks, which is going to cost you $20,000 or $30,000 in compensation costs. Obviously, way more than a keyboard tray. Or they may never come back, and it's going to cost you a lot of money. I remember getting a call from one of the managers, and they said, one of our new workers is complaining that they're having pain in their wrist. So I went over and I looked at what they're doing, and they actually had keyboard trays and all the other neat things. And I just looked at it and said, well, all you have to do is adjust your keyboard tray, and you'll get your hand into that neutral position, and you'll stop feeling this pain. And the worker said, nobody told me how to adjust it. So there's a failure on the part of the manager to make sure that they're orienting their people properly. But don't ignore some of these simple things that can actually have some pretty big implications for costs down the road. Legionella and mold. I remember pension, we got a call not long into COVID where they thought somebody actually had COVID in this workplace. And what it turned out is, and the reason I'm talking about this, it was Legionella they got. And because a lot of your buildings are unoccupied or have been unoccupied, and water is standing around, and when it stands around for more than a week or so, there's a strong potential for Legionella to start developing. And this is what happened there. So these things, don't go away if you don't manage them properly. Contractor management, we talked about this is, fundamental, and I'll talk a little more about how you manage contractors. But when they're on site, whether you realize it or not, they are your employees, and you are responsible for them as much as you can control what they do. And this is what the ministry is going to come in and look at, is what control did you have? And if you had control over the hazard that led to somebody's injury, then you're going to be held accountable for it, whether you think you have some contract or not. Because I can tell you, when I was with the ministry and, I'd do investigating accidents, and the employer would show me, well, we have a contract with this company, and it says right here that we're not responsible for their health and safety. And my very short, curt answer to that is, I don't care about your contracts. All I care about is what the law says. And that's all the ministries can do and can and will do, is worry about what the law says. They're not interested in the contracts. You can sue them. You can do whatever you want to. The ministry is going to look for who is responsible. Who is responsible for the spill that got into the natural environment? Who is responsible for this person losing their fingers? The other one we see quite commonly is pre-start health and safety reviews. So these are required for a lot of different things under the regulations. And very often we'll actually see these documents, but the engineer will come in and look at this, and they'll say, okay, you are in compliance, except you need to do A, B, and C. And the employers have these pre-start health and safety reviews, and they never made sure that A, B, and C were complied with, or don't have any documentation that they were complied with. So essentially, they're required to have these pre-start health and safety reviews for guarding and ventilation and a bunch of other stuff. And they think they're in compliance, and they're not. So again, when you hire companies to do this, I don't understand why these other consultants aren't reminding clients that, by the way, did you comply with these other things I told you to comply with? Because you're not in compliance until you do that. So this is pretty fundamental. Key safety or fire safety. Most of the times, close to 50% or more of the findings that I have for a health and safety audit are fire code related. And this is because the fire code is very complicated and people don't seem to really understand it. And the companies that they hire to come in and test, inspect, and check their systems don't seem to understand all the requirements themselves, or just don't care. I'm not sure, but there's all kinds of things. There's a difference between an inspection, test, and a check. So when you're looking at your fire extinguishers every month, that's really just a check. And then annually they got to be tested and inspected and a bunch of other things. But these are words that are defined in the fire code. Fire alarms. So many companies, again, just did an audit. How often do you inspect your fire alarm? Once a year, a company comes in. Fire alarms actually have to be checked daily. And I know you're going to be upset about this, but I mean, really all you need to do is, and why there's enunciator panels in some of your lobbies, As you look at it, there's a green light on, yes, the fire alarm is on, and there's no yellow lights, meaning there's no problem in any of the zones. But on every month, you're supposed to be checking a certain percentage of the devices that will make the fire alarm go off to make sure they're working. So there's a lot of requirements there. Sprinklers, same thing. Well, they come in once a year. Well, there's weekly requirements to make sure that the valves are open and the gauges and are reading what they're supposed to make sure there's enough pressure in the system. So, and these are things to be looked into. We certainly do see companies that are in full compliance with these requirements, but it's very common to see that they're not. Fire dampers and fire separations. People like putting holes in walls. If you have a multi-story building and you're cutting a hole in the floor, that is clearly a fire separation. When you're done with that, you have to use products like Fire Stop or concrete to return it to its original rating. So these are very common things where people are punching holes in walls and ceilings and not resealing them up to make sure that fire cannot go from one floor to the next, which can be very important if you have a fire. Emergency generators, you need to ask this question. If you have emergency generators, do they supply life safety systems like emergency lighting, fire alarms, and sprinklers? If they do, they need to comply with CSA C282, and there's some very extensive inspection requirements there. Combustible dust, again, just did an audit, and where do we see this large dust collector inside a building? That's prohibited by the fire code and the industrial regulations unless there's a whole bunch of things in place, and that requires engineered drawings and engineers to sign off on it. So again, this workplace, okay, you have a dust collector inside, do you have engineering drawings that say that this was installed properly and approved by the fire department? No records. So that's a big no-no. You need to have those records in place. Flammable liquid storage, again, people, you can't store 45-gallon drums of anything anywhere outside of a remote building or in a special room. So you need to be very careful of where you're storing flammable liquids. On the environmental side, we see a lot of manifest issues. We see a lot of people signing manifests when they're getting rid of hazardous waste or subject waste, as it's called in Ontario, and they don't have their TDG training, which they're required to have in order to ship those goods. But the other thing is there's 6 parts to these forms, if you're not familiar with it. So you keep 2 of them. One of them goes to the Ministry of Environment. 1 you keep for your own record, and then the other 4 go with the transportation company, and then 2 of them end up with the final destination where they destroy or recycle the product, whatever they're doing, and then they send the part 6, the brown copy, back to you, back to that address, and that is your confirmation that your waste has now been handled and is under the control of a licensed handler. And a lot of companies never get those part 6 back, so they don't even know whether their waste is sitting in a ditch somewhere. And if within 4 weeks of not getting that, you have to notify the Ministry of Environment that you haven't received it. So, these are very common things. So, just look at the paper trail for hazardous waste. Because the last thing you want is a phone call saying, we found a drum in the ditch and it's got your company's name on it. What do you know about it? Well, we got rid of that a month ago. Yeah, well, it's still yours because you can't prove it actually ended up where it was supposed to. So waste management, making sure in Ontario, you can only keep waste around for 90 days and you have to ship it off. We see a lot of violations of that requirement. And if you have to do that, then, you have to notify a director that you're going to keep it. And it's really not a big deal. Very often they will approve those kind of things, but so one of the things you need to do here is track the first time you put waste into a container. And the 90 days starts ticking from there. So these are just things, again, common findings that we have. Spill containment and prevention. If you're storing containers near doorways or near drains, you need to have secondary containment and other ways of making sure that things don't get into the natural environment. So these are things we look for. If you have a drum in the middle of your workplace and there's no drains around, there's no cracks in the floor, you have a spill, that's on you. But if it gets into the natural environment or gets into the sanitary system, then the municipality and the Ministry of Environment are not going to be very happy with you. Npr reporting. So what is this? This is National Pollutant Release Inventory. And literally everybody has to comply with this requirement. And so every year, the federal government sends out a notice in the Canada Gazette and says, here's all the things that you'd have to notify us of you having on site. It doesn't matter whether you admit it to the environment, what happens to it. My previous employer, again, we used to manufacture rail cars, and we got some of these materials in the steel and stuff that we use. And we had to report, even though very little of that went into the environment. It was ended up in a rail car, but it came onto the site. So you need to review this every year and make sure that either you have to report again or you don't have to report. And all it takes is for you to make sure and have the document saying, yes, we reviewed the Canada Gazette and we don't have to report again. It's just one of those things that, how aggressive is Environment Canada for coming out and looking at these things? I don't think too aggressive, but it's just a small thing to do and take care of.
David, I'm going to interrupt you just temporarily. A question came in on the chat regarding the TDG training, and I think it's a good thing to talk about.
Sure.
The question was, if you have an administrator who is just looking at filing the paper copies, so the question was specifically, does the person who looks after the paper trail, i.e. receiving the copy back, do they need to be TDG certified?
Based on that description, I would say no. So what the regulation requires is anyone who handles, stores, offers for transport is required training. So if you're going to call a company to come in and take your dangerous goods away or your subject waste away, you have to be TDG certified in order to make that phone call. And you need to be TDG certified to actually sign that waste manifest, because you're confirming that all the TDG information is correct on there. If somebody's just getting a part 6 and marrying it up with the part 2, they're not doing anything where they're offering or handling or doing any of those things. So I would say in that case, no. But again, if that person calls the waste hauler to come in and pick up some waste, now they have to be TDG certified. The other loophole, not really loophole, but the other exemption there is probably a better term, is if you're doing work under the direct supervision of somebody who has there's a certification for TDG, then that's okay as well. What does direct supervision mean? The regulation doesn't really say, but you can have one person in there and you could perhaps go to that clerk who's filing saying, can you please call ABC company to come in to pick up this waste? And I would say in that situation, that person is directly supervising that clerk, if that gives you any help. But the regulation is pretty clear about the things that require this training. So it's just a very common thing. Any company that receives dangerous goods as well, that person who's receiving it has to have that training. So, so there's no follow-up questions. I'll kind of leave it at that. Is that good?
Yeah,
okay.
Thanks, David.
Great. Reporting deadlines. If you have the environmental compliance approval, and make sure you send in your things. I mean, everything's electronic these days, and all it does is it allows the government to monitor things without actually having that somebody monitor it. Somebody gets a notification, all of a sudden somebody shows up at your door. I'll go back to that example where my previous employer was fined $50,000. The reason the ministry was there is because somebody made a mistake on a waste manifest and put a waste class on there, and it was the hauler that actually filled it out for us. And they put the wrong waste class in there that we were not registered to actually receive that or to ship those goods. And that sent the ministry out. And when the ministry got this, says, well, why I'm there, I'll have a look around. Bingo, that little mistake on that manifest cost $50,000 because our person did not double check to make sure that was a waste class they were allowed to ship. I see there was another little Q&A question came up there, possibly.
No, they were just thanking you for your response. All good.
Oh, good. Yeah. I like being thanked. Ozone depleting substances, this can be complicated, but so you have provincial regulations, you have federal regulations. So this is a case where both of them apply. And what the federal government does, and what their regulation does, is manage the import, export, and manufacture of ozone depleting substances. So you should be aware of that, because you may have an air conditioning system or refrigeration system where the next time you have a problem with it, you're not going to be able to get that ODS because it's no longer available because it's been banned. So these are things that we certainly recommend companies to do, but we do see a lot of companies where they're not managing their operations properly. There may be leaks. If there's testing of the system, there's documentation that's required to be affixed right to the air conditioning itself. So we see a lot of issues with that. Sanitary and storm sewer compliance, particularly if you're managing strip malls or have a large commercial building, what you really need to do is look at what your tenants do and determine whether there's any risk, because you'll have this combined sanitary system, and all the municipality will know is that it came from your building. And so there's a lot of cases where maybe you should be doing sampling to make sure your clients aren't dumping things down drains and that kind of stuff. And the other is storms, is you need to make sure that things are not getting into the storm system. Despite arguments I've had with other consultants, most storm sewer systems go right into fresh body waters like Lake Ontario, the Grand River, and those kind of places without treatment. And so you need to, when you have storm sewers on site, you need to make sure that you're not letting things go in there. And if you're a property manager, for instance, is making sure your tenants aren't letting things get into the storm sewer. Because there's ways that if things get in there, you can notify the municipality and they can come and they can shut gates off and make sure that stuff gets cleaned up before it gets into those natural bodies of water. Water resources approvals, it's becoming more and more, this is just a warning what's happening in Ontario. Some of you may have overstrength agreements with the municipality. Those are slowly disappearing. And so they're requiring companies to manage the wastewater and stuff on site. That may require you to have a Water Resources Act approval and environmental compliance approval to do that. So just things to look out for. And operating procedures, it's got to be 90% of the audits I do that are environmental in nature. If you have an environmental compliance approval or environmental activities sector registry registration, then you will be required to have operating procedures for all the equipment that emit things into the air. And it can be quite simple. You may have a very simple little system where there's a fan that exhausts, and you just need to have a procedure that says how you're going to manage and make sure that that system is working properly. But very often we do not see these procedures, and they're all the ECAs require it, and all the ESERs require having these operating procedures. So TSSA, so these are other common things. Propane storage. Again, just did an audit this week, and what do we find? Violations of the propane storage and handling code, because under the Technical Standards and Safety Act, there's a bunch of CSA standards and other standards that have been adopted. And what you need to look at is this thing called the Code Adoption Regulation. And in there you will see that the propane storage and handling code, if I'm quoting it properly, is something that's expected to be being compliant. So what do we see? They're storing it too close to doorways. They're not, the cages they have them stored in are not screwed down to the ground. They're not on non-combustible materials. They're storing the propane cylinders upside down, which is going to lead to a huge issue because there's a pressure relief valve on those things, and the code requires you to always make sure that those things are in the vapor space, which means they always have to be up. So, what some companies do is, well, the empty ones we store upside down. Well, none of these things are ever completely empty, and you can never store propane cylinders upside down. The only time they can be on their side is when they're hooked up to equipment, and you'll see this thing called a locator pin, very complicated, I know, very technical term there, that really just makes sure that that pressure relief valve is in the vapor space at the top of the tank. So a lot of issues there. Tank management, there's a bunch of different things. There's CSA standards to comply with, or there's fire code depending on the situation. And so we see a lot of tanks that aren't managed properly, including contents reconciliation, making sure diesel tanks and gasoline tanks don't have too much water in the bottom, and a bunch of other things. All these things they need to comply with either through TSSA and very often also through the fire code. Not handling liquid fuels. A lot of companies will pump their own liquid fuels on site, and none of their people that do this are trained on how to clean up spills or how to deal with the equipment. And there's requirements under the Liquid Fuels Handling Code, which is another thing adopted under that code adoption regulation that requires you to have all this training and signage and a bunch of other things in place. So motor vehicles, heating, it depends what it's for. So there's the code adoption regulation I'm talking about. So just one more thing to try and convince you of why it's important to comply. And I keep talking about this case because it was the biggest one that really hit. Most people may have heard about and may have forgotten about, and this is Metron. In 2009, 6 people got onto a swing stage in Toronto. 4 of them died and 1 was hurt very seriously. The supervisor ended up going to jail, I think. It's hard to keep track because there are so many appeals. I believe they went to jail for 3.5 years. And there's a lot of things to understand here. So what the criminal code, so they were charged under the criminal code and the Health and Safety Act. Everyone who undertakes or has authority to direct another person does work or performs a task is under legal duty to take reasonable steps to prevent bodily harm to that person or any other person arising from that work task. And so they have to contravene that requirement to take reasonable steps. And here is very important because typically in legislation, and means you need to satisfy both, and that's certainly the case here. You have to show wanton and reckless disregard for the lives of others. And this is what this person did. So I don't know if you're familiar with swing stages. They're very often used for cleaning windows on high buildings. This was being used to repair balconies on a high rise. And if you know about these things, usually there's only 2 places for people to hook up. And in this case, there were 6 people on there. So they overloaded it. They didn't train people. There was a lot of issues because most of the people that died, I think of all the people that died, English was not their first language. So English was not something they were actually very good at. And so they were never trained even in their own mother tongue. So, I mean, these are things just to think about in this world of making sure that we're training people properly. So this is all very important stuff. So that's what they look like after the case. And again, this was, to make it even sadder, was on Christmas Eve. And why they did this, instead of taking the elevator in the building down, they all got onto the swing stage. This was the end of the day. They were on their way home. And that swing stage, they were going to jump on the swing stage to go all the way down. And the supervisor let them do it. And the interesting thing here is what all your managers should pay attention to is, usually these charges under the criminal code are for like CEOs and people that have control of the workplace. But in this case, this supervisor who was on site was considered to be an extension of the employer and was essentially functioning as a CEO or somebody obviously who had authority over a worker. And the employer didn't even have to know, because the employer did not know that the supervisor was doing this, that this decision was being made, and the employer was still held accountable for that. So think about that when you're worrying about what do your supervisors do, what do they know, how do they control things going to workplaces, what decisions are they making when they're out there. So very important. The other thing that happened is they were initially fined $200,000 under the criminal code. The Crown appealed it, and the courts raised the fine to $750,000, knowing full well that it would put the company out of business. So they essentially, made they essentially capital punishment on the part of the employer because they went out of business because they knew that there's usually fines are based on deterrent, and it's usually based on the company's ability to pay. And in this case, the courts went way above that, and appeal after appeal after appeal, all these rulings were still held. So you can be criminally liable for the actions of your supervisors. I don't want your senior executives, if you're on this call, to lose some sleep, but you need to be serious about this stuff. Because if supervisors commit serious, wanton, reckless disregard for safety, you may be held accountable as the company. And so, you just need to be aware that this is actually going on. So, again, why does ISO? You look at ISO standards. If you've ever looked at them, at the very least, my recommendation is you look at an ISO standard, see all the things that are in there, and determine whether they create any value for you in your workplace. And you'll probably find they will, because the ISO standards are based on years and years and years, and I'm not exaggerating on the years and years and years stuff, of experience of what a good management system is in the workplace, because they've learned from the past. So CEO commitment and a few other things that we talked about, but you don't have to be ISO certified. It's just, one day, just, get a copy of the ISO standard and have a read through it and go, oh, that's a good idea. Why does that make? Why are they doing that? There must be a reason for it, because I guarantee there is. And that's pretty important.
I'm gonna catch you before you move on to this next one, David. We had a question come in.
Yep.
Could you elaborate a bit regarding land soil contamination issues that you noted under environmental findings? So the types of things that I'm assuming the types of things that you might find in that kind of scenario.
Well, the things we very often see is, and I can remember, I see one in my mind right now of an audit I just did about 3 or 4 months ago, where they put some equipment outdoors and they put it on pavement, but it was near the edge, and there was a large release of oil, and the oil went into the soil. And that is clearly a violation of the environmental requirements for spill reporting. Now, there are some, there's a spill exemption regulation in Ontario, and every province has this, but is it environmental contamination? Yes, it is. Is it easy to clean up? Yes, it is. So there, there's a lot of things, but again, these are things that need to be reported. But if you're wondering about the legal obligation, again, my son just bought a condo in Montreal, and we have to pay this land transfer tax. And what the land transfer tax really is you're paying rent. He's paying rent for that property. When I bought this house, I paid the land transfer tax because I'm essentially renting the property until I sell it from the federal government. And that's the way it all works. So you don't own the soil. So if you're storing waste outside, make sure it's on secondary containment. Like a lot of people, what they miss is things that are on their way out of the workplace or things coming into the workplace. They just think about a loading dock. Where's a good place where you might find a spill where you have lift trucks moving equipment around that may, pierce a drum, and they're on a loading dock. And a lot of loading docks I see, there's a storm drain right there, because very often they're on a slope, and you want to manage the storm water so it's not building up. So you need to be having spill containment. And I would certainly recommend secondary containment, but I understand some of the challenges of doing that when you're bringing in large amounts of material. But these are things that need to be controlled. So, if there is small spills, if somebody's parking in a parking lot and their radiator bursts open and glycol gets into the storm drain, call the municipality. My experience anyways, you'll be surprised how amenable they are to helping you make sure that glycol radiator fluid does not get into Lake Ontario or 16 Mile Creek or whatever body of water may be going to. So, and they will be appreciative of you taking that effort. So hopefully that answers some of it, but you can't just store things out in your back 40. And if there's potential for a spill, you got to make sure that all the steps are taken to have secondary containment. If you're looking for guidance on this, the last thing I'll say is there's a Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, Conservation and Parks guideline on how you manage waste chemicals in the workplace. And if you're not complying with that guideline, again, I'll warn you about this. If you're not complying with a government guideline, you better be doing something equivalent, because they will enforce that guideline as if it is law. And that is the way it is. I know health and safety regulators, lawyers that I deal with, and they go to court, and employers are being held accountable for their own internal written procedures because they're not complying with them. Because the courts are saying, you, Mr. Employer, know the hazards in your workplace and you know best. And if you required this to be in place, then you should make sure that it was actually enforced as well. So these are all just things to think about, but there is guidelines that tell you how big secondary containment should be and a bunch of other things. Some of the stuff we see is what I would call drip protection. So bottom line, 110% of the volume of that container, that needs to be the size of the secondary containment. So hopefully that answered most of that question, if not a little long-winded. So, okay. So if there's any other questions, I'll be more than happy to stop and respond to those. So in Ontario, we have this requirement to prepare and review at least annually a written occupational health and safety policy and develop and maintain a program to implement that policy. What you're seeing more and more in every piece of legislation is written documents, and this is what you should be doing. But here's some advice. If you're going to write a policy, a health and safety policy, environmental policy, your CEO or the top senior person in your company better be signing off and approving that, because this is one of the most fundamental things you should be doing. Because I'll tell you a funny story. If you have a health and safety policy that says, we used to have 10 fatalities a year, so we're planning on only killing 5 people a year. And if you post that as your health and safety policy, there's nothing the ministry can do about it. You have a policy posted. And if you don't believe me, just where does it say that? All it says is prepare and review at least annually a written occupational health and safety policy. It doesn't say what it has to be in there. Sounds funny, true, but that's what the law says. The law says you shall, when the committee meets, you shall make and keep minutes. It doesn't say how long you have to keep the minutes of that meeting for. So somebody comes in and says, okay, where's your committee minutes? Say, well, we kept them and we made them and we kept them for 1 minute and then we threw them in the garbage. Technically, I'm laughing, of course, but technically you prepared and kept those minutes. So again, you can play a lot of things, but the danger on the other side is the ministry can read things into legislation, and they do, because all the ergonomic stuff is written under Section 45 of the industrial regulations, and it was never envisioned to include ergonomics in that particular sentence. So anyways, so make sure your policing is meaningful, make sure that you're getting the resources to actually implement that program. Because again, if you don't implement it, you may be held accountable in a court of law for not following your own procedures. Have a monitoring program in place, and this again, where consultants can come in, is that provide that third party to look at what's going on. But make sure, don't just write procedures and policies and practices and anything else you want to call it. Make sure they're being complied with. And that doesn't mean going out every day, but have a reasonable frequency in place. And if you see something that you're seeing repeated non-compliances, then that's just going to tell you need to look at it more. And if you see things that are always in compliance, then that means, well, maybe we need to look at this less and spend our time on the other things. Job descriptions must include health and safety responsibilities and accountability. This is a very common thing under the old Workwell. I don't know if they still do it in the WSIB, but every procedure you write, because I see lots of wonderful procedures, but it doesn't say anywhere in there who is what responsible for what. So if you want your supervisor to make sure that people are doing things, then you need to say the supervisor shall do this, the workers shall do this, and then you'll know who's responsible. Because when it gets down to it, says, well, we're supposed to inspect that harness when that person went on the roof and it failed, and now they got hurt very badly. Oh yeah, so who was supposed to inspect it? Well, no, it doesn't say anywhere. It just says it has to be inspected. That's going to lead you to all kinds of problems. And the other thing, the ministry love to see when you're saying, as an employer, our supervisor or our worker, we're supposed to do this, and here I can show you records where they're disciplined, and there's due diligence for that. Again, my previous employer, 2 critical injuries where people fell off the rail cars. Neither time was the company charged. Why? Because we had training records. Twice a year, we went through where you have to require fall protection when you're not. At least twice a year, we did safety meetings. The supervisors trained everyone on what they're supposed to do. And in fact, we suspended disciplined 11 people in 1 year for not following the rules. There was nothing more the employer could do, and the ministry agreed. Later on, after I left, somebody died in that workplace. They went through all the records, and the ministry, this is a little upsetting to me, because I remember talking to the manager, who I knew quite well, and he said, they came in to do this investigation, and the inspector looked at me and said, your confined space procedure doesn't comply with the regulation. And the manager had this sinky feeling in his stomach going, oh boy, here we go. And then the inspector laughed, and I thought it was a little, I wasn't there, of course, but this is a fatality investigation. He said, it's better than the legislation. And as far as I know, because that fatality happened about 3 years ago, that again, the employer was not charged, because they had a good system in place, and they enforced it, and they made sure that all the rules were being followed. And workers made decisions that got themselves into trouble. Unfortunate, yes, but the employer was still deemed to do everything reasonable in the circumstances to protect them. And they spent all that money doing it and saved millions of dollars in legal and fees and fines. So, well, contractor management, I'm trying to get through this fairly quickly, but it is not all their responsibility. If you don't believe that they're your employees when they're on site, I'm sorry, but you're gravely mistaken, because they are under some of your control. It may be if something happens and the ministry only looks at that service provider or that contracted employer, but they're going to be looking at what you're doing and seeing, what control did you have, what control should you have had, and what things should you have done. So you need to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that requires a little bit of due diligence on your part. So the audit starts before they get there, and I know a lot of you probably have these things, but you make sure that they have their WCB, or in Ontario, their WSIB clearance, to make sure they're insured. They have other insurances if they're coming on site working as electricians, pipe fitters, or whatever. They're required to have TSSA licenses. Have they been trained properly when they get on site? Do they have training? Like a lot of you, I'm sure, have orientations. And very often, when my previous employer would bring contractors on site, we would bring them all into a room and we train them all. And then, on Friday and then Monday, they'd be there to do work. And we would make sure that, we train Joe, and all of a sudden Joe's sick and they bring Fred on, and Fred hasn't been trained. We gave them all these little certificates, and we could go and confirm that they actually received that orientation training. So these are, very common things to see under these systems. Do they have a safety manual? I will warn you, this is my professional opinion, I guess, as it were, but if you ask your contractors for a copy of the safety manual, you better read it. If you just confirm that you actually have a management system, a whole different kettle of fish. To take us back to our previous case study. Because if there's something in that safety manual that's wrong, you now have possession of it, and you may be held accountable. The big may, capital letters, underlined, italics, and bold, but you just make sure that, do what you're saying you're doing, make sure that they're doing it. A lot of companies ask to see accident statistics because they don't want to deal with employers that have a lot of accidents. This is very common, but certainly up to you to do. What equipment are they bringing on site? What's the condition of it? What kind of things? I can tell you, we had a company that was coming in, a previous employer, to clean the inside of a rail car. And of course, there's a confined space entry and very serious confined space, because this is one where you would even put your hand in there and there was so much acid mist and stuff in the air that you could receive burns in your hand just sticking your arm in there. And so I asked them a simple question: do you have a confined space procedure? Oh, yes, we do. They sent it to me. So we're sitting down in the pre-meeting, and I said, oh, it says here that you have this particular gas monitor. Well, we don't have one yet, but we're going to buy one. And then you realize that all they did was they found a confined space procedure somewhere, they put their letterhead on it, and they just gave me what I asked for. But because I went that extra mile, I made sure that none of those contractors were going to die on site or get hurt when they're on our site. And this is what, if you deal with contractors, some of the less sophisticated ones will do whatever you ask them to do. But if you just ask for a procedure, they'll give you one, but be careful and make sure they're actually following it. Do they have emergency procedures? In case you don't know, under the construction regs, every constructor has to have a written procedures of how they're going to deal with emergencies on site. So they all have to have it. Pretty simple. So make sure your contract shouldn't just say, we expect you to comply with all applicable laws and regulations. That's just not cutting it in courts anymore. You need to be much more specific about what you expect them to comply with. And there may be some specific things, like I mentioned, we expect you to comply with this CSA standard. We expect you to comply with this standard. We expect you to comply with this section of the regulation. There's all kinds of things you can do without, getting too deep into it and, pulling out every section of the regulation that apply. That's not necessary, but you need to be more explicit in your contracts of what you expect them to do. Oh, once they get on site, like I said, confirm their training records and orientation, looking at what condition it's in. Are they bringing stuff on site they shouldn't have? Or are they bringing things on site they said that there wasn't on the list of things they're bringing on site? Because very often some of the hazardous materials that some of your workers may be exposed to is only when contractors come on site. They bring oxyacetylene torches on site. They bring diesel fuel on site to fuel their equipment. All these things that your workers are not familiar with. And if your workers are going onto these construction sites, hey, they need women's training on all these particular materials as well. It's maybe under their control, but it's now on your site and your workers are exposed to it. So I get my head. Housekeeping, this is, a big thing. How many times do contractors come on site and they leave a big mess? I mean, there's a lot of reason for that, but I can tell you a lot of very large studies were done, and when there's good housekeeping going on, accident rates are lower. It's just simple facts and things that go on in safety, and it's all because of tripping hazards and a bunch of other things. But, dirty workplaces, dirty workplace practices. And are they doing what they said they would do? Pretty important. So we do these audits and, contractors, and, this is a lovely picture, and this is, really good to, because you go onto contractor site, construction sites, and you see extension cords all over the place because they're using power tools and they're doing this and they're doing that. And, the answer was, how can you possibly expect us to make sure that all these things are off the floor? Well, this particular constructor was given very clear instructions from the company that hired them that you will not have things on the floor. And look at the solution they came up with. They brought all these things in, all the lines went up, hanging in the rafters, and were hanging down. And there were some places where there was tripping hazards, but not everywhere you turn, which you see on some construction sites. Well, there's a will, there's a way, and I can tell you, in my professional opinion, contractors are still not as risk averse as they should be. They've gotten a lot better, but they still allow like tripping hazards and a bunch of other things to happen that you would not see in other workplaces. And until they get that, there's always going to be increased injuries on construction, as there has been, unfortunately. So when the ministry comes on site, why do they do inspections? Well, because they do annual routine inspections. They have targets, Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Environment, have targets. I know, the dangerous thing about the Ministry of Environment sometimes is during the summer, they'll hire students to come around and follow up on ECA requirements. For instance, we had them come into my previous employer, and all they know is what they're asked to look for. And one of the things they're looking for is, where's your operating procedures? Where's your annual report you're supposed to comply with? Where's this? Everything that's in your ECA, they're going to say, where's this? Where's this? Where's this? Where's this? And that's what's going to get one of their enforcement officers in, because the Ministry of Environment's like that. They have field officers, and then when this other person shows up, all of a sudden it's, here's my card, I'm an enforcement officer. You're now potentially in trouble. They only come out when they're considering prosecution. But anyway, so they have their targets, and who knows what they may be. I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into it. Evaluate compliance based on announced targets. So there may be legislative changes, there may be changes in sectors, there may be referrals they're getting. Who knows, unions are calling them. They certainly, if they're dealing with noise and odor complaints, the Ministry of Environment is going to come in. If there's spills, if there's critical injuries, fatalities, work refusals, they're going to be, the ministry is going to show up for these things because they have to. I know there's some virtual stuff going on, but this is, hopefully we're getting back to normal, and you're going to see these people coming out and do this stuff. And it doesn't matter who it is. Environment Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, they certainly, it depends on the province. I've seen them. We do a lot of environmental emergency plans. And for those, we see some very aggressive officers. There's been some in Quebec that have really been out there knocking on doors and following up on stuff. A few out in the Maritimes. But we've also seen the Ministry of Environment in Ontario asking for environmental emergency plans just to see where they have them and other things that's required by Environment Canada. They're just asking. You don't have to provide it to them because it's really not under, as far as I'm concerned, under the jurisdiction, but that's probably not somewhere you want to go, because you're going to accept the officer if you're trying to be difficult and say, no, I don't have to do that. And you do, as we'll talk about, handle inspectors a little different than that, though. And Transport Canada, again, you don't see them very often, but they do come around and do stuff. Again, from the rail business I was in, we saw Transport Canada a lot. So it may just depend on their targets or other things that are going on. So in Ontario, there's been some significant changes in the Health and Safety Act about respiratory protection. There's now requirements that anyone who's wearing a respirator in your workplace, you must have a written program in place. And this doesn't include, CSA approved fit testing, care, storage, and use. And see, this is a change from the way the regulation was written before, where if respirators were voluntary, you could kind of do what you wanted, what you felt like doing. And now the regulations changing, and the ministry is doing presentations. Recently, I know some of our hygienists were at some of these meetings and say they see somebody wearing a respirator, they're going to be looking for programs because that's what it says. This is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. Looking at asbestos. Again, I'll tell you a somewhat funny story. Don Pynchon, who founded our company, when he started looking at asbestos, and he was, if you know Don Pynchon, he was involved with the Royal Commission report on asbestos in buildings, repair operations. He pretty much wrote the regulation, but he thought this would be a good place to start his business, but it wouldn't last very long. And to this day, 40 some years later, I believe, something like that, the ministry is still having to hammer companies that have asbestos in their buildings and people who are removing asbestos and not doing it properly, because they have a new impetus to go out and look at where these things are being used. And you may be surprised, but I will tell you, up until 2018, asbestos was not banned in all buildings. And I've been into a number of buildings recently that were built only in the last 5 or 10 years that have transite rainwater leaders in them, and transite is an asbestos containing material, and they have them in the building. So don't think that this is a new building, we don't have it. We were doing some audits recently, and we found out they're putting in soundproofing doors that contain lead. So lead is still being installed in new buildings. So don't be surprised that, like if someone comes in and says you should be doing a hazardous material assessment. Well, the building's brand new. Well, you should still have one to make sure that you're covered off all these things. So the Ministry of Environment on their side, we're trying to reduce the amount of waste going into landfill, and there's a whole bunch of things going on there. There's a new blue box regulation coming out. There's a lot of new regulations that are mostly focused on the manufacturers and suppliers of goods to make sure they have recycling plans in place. So if you're one of them, then these things are happening. Of course, we still have the non-hazardous waste regulations in place for doing waste audits and those kind of things. So, but there's a big focus on trying to reduce the waste going to landfill. So pay attention to your packaging audits, your waste audits, your recycling programs, because these are the focus of the government, Ministry of Environment this year. Looking at keeping our water safe, so there's a bunch of things. There is a water taking regulation, and they're putting more teeth in that. There's companies that take huge amounts of water out of rivers and lakes to use in their processes, and the ministry's looking very hard at that, and making sure that we're not contaminating water, all the storm sewer and sanitary sewer stuff we were talking about as well. Protecting air, so Ministry of Environment Ontario, again, very aggressive when it comes to air standards, requirements for ECA, so all those things are going to be there. Protecting natural spaces and species. You may say, well, we don't, we have the Fisheries Act and Migratory Birds Act. There's all kinds of, like I said, you wouldn't believe the regulations and acts that are out there, but you may around your building, all of a sudden you see, you see these brown bats flying around. Now, those brown bats may very well be a protected species, and now you can't just, because one of your tenants complains about it, you can go and wreck that house that that bat was in. You're going to have to do something, because these regulations are getting much stricter when it comes to species at risk. So a lot of that stuff. Climate change, I'm not going to go on about that. We all know about all the things going on. Holding polluters accountable. So again, these are initiatives, probably nothing unlike other years, but they're more likely to come on site and say, what's that distress vegetation on your property? Oh, we had a spill. What happened to it? We didn't do anything. And now it's seeping, it's getting into the aquifers, into the groundwater. And now you have a big problem. And a lot of you probably heard of trichloroethylene or TCE, and the millions of, a lot more of money that being spent cleaning up that stuff, because it seemed to have been used quite a bit. Supporting infrastructure development, we're ensuring environmental protection. So, obviously we know about all the light rail and all the other things going on, making sure that things are done properly. So these are things that the Ministry of Environment is looking at. So prepare for the visit. So now we're right into the heart of it. Have a good inspection and monitoring program. Make sure you're doing what you say you're doing. Don't just write procedures or think you're complying with legislation if you're not willing to go out and do stuff. And it can be simple things, So I'm going to talk about, again, you need the government inspectors to believe that you get it. And what that means is they believe that you honestly are trying to comply. And like I said, there's hundreds of regulations to comply with the environmental side, and a big handful of them on the health and safety side. You're not expected to know every little section in there, and the inspector may come on site and say, by the way, did you know you need to do this? And you go, sorry, I didn't know that. But when they ask you traditional Ministry of Labor stuff, training programs, do you have training records? Can you prove your people have had awareness training? Can you prove they had women's training? Can you prove they've had training on this stuff? when you're the Ministry of Environment saying, and they come in and say, oh, I see you have some drums stored. Where does that drain go? Oh, that drain goes to our oil water separator before it goes to sanitary. Everybody's happy because you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. The ministry believes it. They may ask some more questions, but these are simple things. If you go out into a parking lot and you see storm sewers and see stuff going into it, and you have no idea where that goes to and doesn't go to, now the ministry is going to start asking some hard questions. And so there's just know your facility or know people. You don't have to know everything, but you should know who to call who does. And it may take a couple of calls, but you may have to call your people and culture department to get training records, or you may have to call your environmental coordinator to come in and talk to the Ministry of Environment Inspector. But you need to know what's going on in your own workplace and have a good knowledge of what the regulations require. Keep your records organized. Well organized and accessible. Where your ECAs or EASers, where your pre-start, your inspection records, and again, training records is the key. That's the second thing that's going to come out of the Ministry of Labor's mouth, as I said, if they come in to do an accident investigation. I am here from the Ministry of Labor. Who can I talk to? Where's your training records? Because that's what they're going to want to see. Keep your postings up to date. Maybe a pain sometimes, but you need to do this. If you have a health and safety policy that's signed off every year and you post it, then make sure the posted copy has a signature on it. You actually don't have to post the date on there, but you need to have a record that proves that you actually did the review annually. So you have your choice there. Know what your consultants are doing. It's, it can be scary sometimes. You go in and what are you doing with your ECAs and your annual reporting, your NPR reporting, your EASers, your sanitary sewer systems, and they say such and such consultants take care of all that for us. And the person you talk to, or no one else in the company really knows all the things they do, and they're putting a lot of trust in their consultants. So you can think of what I'm thinking here. You need to go to pension because you can trust us. No, anyway, just understand what your consultants are doing. What kind of reports are they creating? It's it's good to do it. Good to have consultants because they have expertise you may not have. You may not want to pay for, because we see that quite a bit. I'm an occupational hygienist, and a lot of companies, hygienists are not, when they retire, not being replaced, because it's cheaper for them to go out and hire Brian Agnew and Ryan Mallard and Chris Taylor to do that work, because having those big wages around is very often not that cost effective when you have a good system in place already. But really know what your consultants are doing, or how to get a hold of them. The ministry is not going to be upset and say, I have Tom over here and or Jill, and they have the answers, and you get them on the phone or you get the information to the officer and they're happy. But have an idea of what they're doing for you and understand what's required to do. So one of the things under ISO is, when you're doing your risk assessments, is to understand your compliance obligations. So these could be voluntary or mandatory. So at the very least, you should understand all your mandatory requirements. And you may be very surprised how many things you need to comply with. And it's not until you actually go out and look at this stuff that you realize all the things that need to get done. Like the Canada Gazette, as an example, probably almost every month, the Gazette comes out, and it's free to access it. You can get on their subscription list, and they'll be saying such and such chemical is being introduced into Canada, and if you have this chemical in your workplace, you have to report to the federal government. Yeah, I'm not kidding you. That's what the regulation said, or the act says. If you have this particular thing and a notice goes out, you have to report. You even know you had to report. No, why? Because you never looked at the Canada Gazette. You don't even know about NPRI because you never looked at the Canada Gazette. And every January, it comes out and it tells you all the things that have to be reported. And there's some things on there that you may be surprised that have to be reported. and it changes every year. So what you should be doing is developing a compliance obligations registry, so you know all the things you need to comply with, subscribing to the Ontario Gazette and the Canada Gazette, and just having a look at it and see it's once you get used to it, you'll be able to find the stuff you look for quite quickly. But I'm not trying to make your life miserable, make it a little miserable having to look at all these things. But if you're an environmental compliance expert for your company, you should know about these things. Like all the requirements, new regulations and stuff coming out are going to be in those gazettes, and they're free. So just have a look at them. And I know the federal one comes out, I think, every week or every 2 weeks or something. But this should be on the agenda for anybody. Either that or have consultants that will do it for you and make sure. And that's one of the things that Pension tries to do, is make sure, and that's why we just talked about some of the initiatives from the government, that you know what the government's up to and looking at. So to me, that's good advice. Okay. The legislative rights of entry of various inspectors varies. Ministry of Labor and Ministry of Environment inspectors in a lot of cases have more power than the police. The police cannot just come into your workplace without permission. You invite them in, it's like inviting them into your house. Now they can look around and they see a contravention, they're going to act upon it. The Ministry of Labor and Ministry of Environment, they're allowed to come in and do these things. And you may ask questions why, because there has been some court rulings about this. And it's important that you understand this, because the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Environment are allowed to do these things when they're doing inspections. And inspections under the law is much different than doing investigations. So when a Minister of Labor is coming there to do an inspection of your workplace, or the Ministry of Environment is showing up as part of one of their annual targets, and they're doing an inspection in your workplace, they're allowed to ask and see records and stuff that if they're in there doing an accident investigation, for instance, the Ministry of Labor doing a fatality investigation, now they're bound by other requirements. They can't just unreasonably ask you for information, because it is now different. So all those extra powers of entry and all this other stuff, a lot of them revolve around the inspection part. But when they're doing investigations, obviously, if the Ministry of Labor is going to be allowed to come into your workplace if there's a fatality, like, don't misconstrue that. It's them collecting evidence that is now going to be more driven by having warrants and some things. If you're worried personally about what the ministries do, they cannot charge you without reading you your rights. And let me rephrase that. They can't charge you and use evidence that you tell them about unless they've read you your rights. So once an inspector forms a reasonable opinion in their mind that a contravention may have occurred, they are now bound by all the requirements for search and seizure and all the other stuff that is in the law. So if you say something and they go, oh boy, they shouldn't have said that, because now I'm thinking I'm going to charge that person. Right at that instant, they have to read you your rights and afford you the opportunity to have a lawyer present before they can ask you any more questions. Because any questions they ask you after that point is not admissible in court. Of course, you're going to have to go to court, and the lawyers are going to have to say, the inspector asked this question and got all this evidence from our defendant here. And it was at this point when they had already done this, this, and this. And at that point, they should have formed an opinion in mind that they were going to charge this person. So if it gives you any solace, if the ministry's in and they haven't read you your rights yet, you're probably okay. The other thing to remember that is they do not have to read the rights to employers. They can charge employers as much, without reading anyone their rights. But again, the requirements for search and seizure and all the other things may be there. And, one of the cases that happened in Ontario is a Joint Health and Safety Committee member who was not allowed to divulge private information from the company, went and talked to an inspector and gave the inspector a bunch of information. And with that information, the inspector charged the employer. That case was thrown out of court because one, the Ministry of Labor was not entitled to that information. They got the information illegally. What they should have done is taken the information and went and did their own investigation, collected the information on the good, and then they could have successfully charged him for it, but they chose to not do that. So there's a lot of things in there that are out there. But again, if you're wondering why can they do these things, it's mostly revolving around because health and safety and environmental protection is important to everybody, and they should have these powers beyond other regulators so that they can fulfill that obligation. That's why they have those powers. So you show up, be prepared. Don't try not to appear frustrated because frustration is going to find itself on the inspector. I just remember this. I still have this picture of this. I was doing this inspection when I was with the ministry, obviously, with a very large hospital in Ontario. And I went in, I met up with the health and safety person, and they said, how long do you think this is going to take? And in those days, we had to do wall-to-wall inspections. This was a big facility. And when I told them, I figured, well, it's probably going to be about a week. After I picked them up off the floor, we proceeded to do it. And he was actually pretty good about it after that. But you just need to be prepared. They're going to come by. And, the very next line in this is be respectful and expect to be treated with respect. And that's so important. Just be respectful, but expect the ministry officer to treat you with respect as well. And don't be where I've seen other employers going, well, why wouldn't you say something? Well, because we didn't think it was right. We didn't want to argue with the officer. But but now all they have, I remember these examples where all I would ever have as a Minister of Labor is what I got from an irate union official. And there's nothing about unions. There's nothing to do about unions being good or bad, but they're upset. They're arguing with the employer, and the employer chose to say nothing. And so I have to make my decision based on what the information I have. And if there's any of those things that were wrong, then the employer should have brought it up, because they should be expected to be treated with respect. And again, if you think the ministry is wrong, or say, where does it say that? Show me in the legislation where it says I have to do that. The ministry should have to do that. If you want to see their inspector certifications, their ID badges, and some of them actually have badges now. I think they all do now, but they have to show that to you, and that's not dangerous. That's just being wanting to be respectful. But I know lots of Ministry of Labor people, and I can tell you they've admitted, yeah, I know I couldn't do that, but they had other motivation to make the employer do stuff. And this stuff happens. They're people, and they get in there and they get their back up because you're being unrespectful and being unreasonable. It's just going to make them look all the harder. So, just treat them with respect and expect the same. Some people will say, well, I didn't want to do that because I don't want to get in their bad books because they'll be here every week. You just think about how people are. And when I'm sitting in my car in the morning as a Minister of Labor inspector and going, okay, I got these 3 places I need to go to. Wow, I don't know if I want to go back to that place, because that guy is, that person is they give me a hard time every time I'm there. I'm going to go to this other place. So sometimes it's quite the opposite of what you think. But if you just be respectful, but you stand your ground and demand that you're be given the straight goods, you will not be getting the bad books with the ministry, because you're just doing what a good manager in a company should be doing, is making sure, they're not trying to do another reasonable precaution stuff on there for something they have no power to do. because, the respiratory standard things is an important one, because a previous appeal I had with my previous employer was a lot of our welders were respiratory protection on a voluntary basis. And some of them chose not to be clean shaven, which, we don't need to get into all those issues about that, but it was their choice. And we trained them, and they understood what the limitations were. And the ministry said, well, they have to be clean shaven. And they issued an order. And we went to an appeal. I had to go to appeal with this because the inspector wouldn't listen to what I had to say. And, the person hearing the appeal asked a certain who had a beard and said, so is the ministry telling me that if I chose in this boardroom to wear a respirator because I wanted to, then I would have to be clean shaven and have a respiratory protection program? The ministry said, yes. And the adjudicator said, I want you to go back to 400 University and ask them that question. And they dropped the appeal and rescinded the order. Of course, now, as we know, they have the words that says, yes, that this is the case. If wherever a worker is wearing a respirator, you have to have a program in place. But back then it wasn't so. It was unfortunately a fight that we had to have, but we had to stand our ground and make sure we weren't being asked to comply with anything other than what the legislation requires. Make sure, don't think, well, the inspector's here and they can come on site and they don't have to follow COVID rules and they don't have to follow our rules. And, we require hard hats, and the officer doesn't want to wear them. I'd be very surprised if they did that, but they don't want to wear gloves. They're not wearing proper boots because we require 8-inch boots with metatarsal protectors, and the ministry doesn't have that. They have to comply with your safety rule. Unless the ministry changed drastically, that's part of their policy. You comply with the rules of the employer. And so they can't just come and go as they please and break the law, because the law actually says the workers shall wear the personal protective equipment required by their employer. And that's the law. It doesn't matter whether it's required or not. But don't say, oh, you can just come on site, do what you want. And because they're looking, how are they complying with their own program? Oh, you're requiring orientation to come on site? Oh, it's 4 hours. Okay, I have to call my manager and see what we want to do about that. Or, okay, whatever, I'll sit through the 4 hours so I can do it. You need to follow your own rules and expect them to follow them. Provide accurate answers. If you don't know the answer, just say, sorry, I don't know the answer, but I know Jill does know the answer. Jill's not here today. I'm going to have to get back to you with that. You just need to be honest. And again, if you have any questions, I'm going to say one more time, where does it say that? Because that is a very powerful thing that they can say, okay, here's the section. Well, I don't believe that section means that. Well, that's up to you. One of the things that employers don't seem to want to do is appeal inspectors' orders, and you certainly have the power to do that. If you think they're wrong, maybe you need to appeal the order, or you can just comply with it and go on with life. Take your own notes, make sure you're documenting stuff, take pictures. We talked about all the stuff, investigations are different than routine inspections. Again, you have charter rights. If the ministry says, oh, you're not cooperating with me because you won't answer my question, there's a big conflict between your Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and what the Health and Safety Act says. I'm going to put all my eggs in my basket with the Canadian Charter of Rights. And the inspector can issue an order saying you're not cooperating with me because I'm asking you questions. Again, there's going to be a difference whether it's an investigation or an inspection again. But if they're thinking about charging you for not cooperating, hey, now we're into investigation territory. But there is competing requirements in some of this legislation. Okay, so a reasonable person test, that's what the ministry has to comply with. When a reasonable person would think somebody is now violated the legislation and could be charged, that's when the inspector, in fact, they should have even more knowledge about it. So I don't know if you remember Columbo, but this is what, just one more thing. And that's where that was always the clincher, right? So again, this is all the stuff I talked about. Well, there is no unreasonable search and seizure. Again, the only unreasonable part involves when they're doing inspections. They can talk to anyone they want. They don't have to do anything. Again, charter rights. Again, I talked about all this stuff already, so. Yeah, sorry, I'm just, yeah, so these are things I've said already, so we don't need to say it. And so when you finally get to it, they're going to come back with a report. Make sure you go through everything, make sure you're clear about what the ministry inspector wants, when they want it. If the dates aren't reasonable, then negotiate different dates if you can. You know, I know a lot of inspectors issue stop work orders when they come back because you haven't complied, and really stop work orders are for immediate hazards. They're not supposed to be a compliance tool to get you to comply with something else, but that is the way they're used, and I can't change that for you. But you know, stop work orders is, and I'll admit it, as a Ministry of Labor inspector, I couldn't get a company to install an airline respirator in a paint booth because it was too, you know, we can't do this, we can't do this. I issued a stop work order and they had it done in 2 hours. So unfortunately, the ministry gets a bang for the buck when they're issuing stop work orders. But if they're issuing stop work orders, you know, that maybe you can get them to change that. It may be very difficult after they come back with the report, but you know, really understand what they want and when they want it by. And then if you don't, so once you believe in compliance, there's things you can do. So, and if you were not able to meet those compliance dates, then make sure the officer knows about it. Okay, and I've already mentioned the Ministry of Environment group do have enforcement officers that come in to do those investigations. So you'll know you're in trouble with the Ministry of Environment and potentially Environment Canada because they have enforcement officers, and that's all they do is enforce and prosecute people. And, so we talked about appeals. They don't have to listen to you before they issue orders. That's just the way it is. It's what the legislation says. And just because you appeal something doesn't mean that you don't have to comply. And I know it's very aggravating, but that's just the way it works. Now, I already said all the wonderful things consultants can do, but again, they just do have a place in the workplace, but don't ever put all your eggs in one basket. As I said, don't have consultants do all your audits, all your monitoring, because you have no control of your workplace and you won't know what's going on. It'll be in the hands of someone else who, you know, maybe a trusted David Gardner to do all this stuff for you. And then on May 6th, he retires. And all of a sudden, well, where's David Gardner? Well, he's not here anymore. Well, he was supposed to do this for us. Well, we don't know anything about that. So just warning you, use consultants strategically. They can be used extensively if you want, but use them strategically. They can provide expertise. They can provide ongoing support, and they can provide that third-party look that you may not get from your own internal people sometimes. So, closing thoughts. Are you protecting your assets? This is what you're supposed to be doing. And your assets include your employees, maybe a cold way of looking at it. Are you protecting your reputation? Are your stakeholders happy? Are people investing in your REIT because they know you're doing a good job of managing those buildings? Or are your contractors, do you do work for the big 3 or 4, whatever it is now, Toyota, GM, Ford, who are expecting you to have these systems in place? Are you ensuring compliance with minimum expectations? You'll find that legislation is becoming far from minimum requirements anymore. Are you protecting your employees and the environment? We all want that. You know, fundamentally ensuring employees are doing what they say they're doing and your contractors are doing what they say they're doing and getting full value out of your program. That's what you should be doing. So any final questions or comments? Okay. I think that's my last webinar ever. So I'll still be hanging around perhaps if they'll let me, but all the best of luck, and I hope it was informative for you and you're now better prepared to deal with some ministry labor and environment inspectors if they come on site. And certainly if there's any questions you have after this, I'm more than happy to try and answer them for you or to refer you to Chris Taylor or Brian or Ryan.
I will note you have a thanks from Procore. I don't know if you know Darren Harrington, David, but in case you didn't see it, and lots of other things. A last question came in just now, along with a lot of thank yous. Have you seen inspections done on houses of worship? And I would maybe take the subtext as, is a house of worship considered a workplace?
I clearly remember doing I can't remember St. Elizabeth Cathedral, I think, in Hamilton, because they had one worker who was their janitor or maintenance person that went around and cleaned stuff. He fell off the ladder and got hurt, and I was there because they only had one employee. Their accident frequency was through the roof for that year, and I had to deal with it. So anywhere where people work and people get paid or remunerated in some fashion, just read the legislation, is the place where people work. And so houses of worship, if the priests, whatever you want to call them, are getting paid for being there, it's a place to work there. I'd have to look if there's some exemptions, because there's a bunch of exemptions certainly for self-employed workers, which is becoming less and less, but I don't remember any exemptions for churches. They are places of work. I don't think they get inspected very often.
Yeah, and additionally, it's somewhat related to if they're hiring contractors as part of it. The second half of the question came in, what about volunteers? They have rights as employees under the Labor Act, and in many cases, are they doing what would be considered a job is often what we see. Maybe comment on that, David.
Yeah, there's been, again, it's legislative based, and I believe in Ontario, they actually speak about volunteers, and because they need to protect them. A lot of these people are students as well, and they're also protected under the Education Act, and the school boards are required to actually provide protection. But they do speak about volunteers, and again, you need to be careful. You really need to read what the legislation says, but I'm sure you're not going to want to have volunteers come onto your site and have them get hurt or something, because here's the danger. So one thing I didn't talk about, so there's a danger in bringing people into the workplace that are not covered by WSIB or WCB. You're protected from being sued under WSIB and WCB because they're workers. So there's one company we deal with, and they buy these systems that are made by a company in Germany, and that company in Germany does all the installations, and they go all over the world. And they got here, and our client came to us and says, we have these people, and we're out doing an audit of this construction site. And I said, do those people have working at heights training? Well, no, they're not. They're from Germany. Well, in Ontario, anyone working at heights has to have working heights training, and particularly and under the construction regs. So, there's a danger, but the other danger is those workers are not covered by WSIB or WCB. And if they get hurt, they can sue you. You're not protected from being sued. So volunteers could say, you exposed me to a hazard, and I'm going to sue you in court, and that's going to be expensive. So you want to make sure these controls are in place, regardless of whether the legislation protects them. But I'm pretty sure there's some protection under the Health and Safety Act in Ontario that does talk about volunteers, and that there is some due diligence that needs to get done, but I would have to double check that. Cool questions. Okay, well, Darren Harrington is still on there. All the best of luck. I hope you're still, I would I go by the Procore site every week or so. And I see you guys are still working there, so all the best to Procore.
All right, there had been a question about the recording. I'm going to stop the recording here in a moment.
Okay.
The
Yep.
recording will be posted. Our folks will eventually get it posted to the website. I don't see any other questions yet.
And the last one we did of this, which was similar but a little different, is also posted. The live recording is also posted if you want to watch that one as well.